Greetings everyone on this March 1st, 2022, which falls on the celebration of Mahashivaratri. As some of you who are more familiar with Indian culture and Indian heritage may be well aware of. So I would like to take this chance on the great night of Shiva, as it's known in the respective culture that Mahashivaratri stands for, to speak about something which seems to shook the world right at this very moment, as the so-called Russian-Ukrainian conflict has been on all social media, and since the invasion of Russian military onto the Ukrainian territory with the massive assault on its major cities has now dominated the news channels. It seems what else can be added to that what for many people seems very obvious. And when we say that for many people it seems very obvious, we immediately, of course, speak of the obviousness of how each and every one of us tend to take a certain perspective, which of course often, if not always, colored by deeply personal values that we hold. So therefore these perspectives, even if they have been exposed to a variety of influences, they are nevertheless very subjective to how we understand this whole situation. So therefore it's hardly surprising that what we now find ourselves in these trenches of polarized opinions with regard to what is this conflict, what is this war about, whom is to blame. And of course, whenever we say that, we're under danger of being politically incorrect, because obviously the aggressor is there to be blamed, always the aggressor. So in this case, Russia seems to be quite blatantly took that side of aggressing the sovereignty of the Ukraine. But that, of course, is immediately being countered by another very valid argument that the war didn't start just a few days ago. The war in Ukraine has started 8 years ago, and this fact somehow has been less prominently featured on the news and in the social media. But the fact remains that these two nations, great nations, brotherly nations, in fact, are now in this mortal combat. And what I would like to speak here today is not to what perspective one is ought to adopt, what am I advising to view this conflict under what lens, but rather something which inescapably pressing on my chest as that moral obligation which prompts me to speak. And before I begin, I would like to introduce myself for those who are not perhaps familiar with who I am and what I do. But I was born in Uzbekistan, in the city of Tashkent, to a mixed marriage of Ukrainian lady who is my mother, who was born in Western Ukraine, so therefore she was Ukrainian by passport even back then in the days of the Soviet Union, and a Tajik father who was from Kanibadan. So already from the early age I used to this perplexity of who and where do I belong, where is my tribe, what pack shall I run with, so to speak. It was not always easy, because on one hand I deeply felt the affinity with Asian Central Asian culture. My father, of course, as that would be the custom, born into a Muslim family, whereas my mother, who was, I could say, an atheist or agnostic all her life, and only became religious, more that we should say spiritual, towards the second half of her life, was born in the Christian family, as her mother and father, my grandparents, belong to that background. So therefore there is this additional very personal, deeply intimate side to this what I'm sharing here. So I'm not speaking here neither as a detached spiritual teacher, nor as a so-called political commentator who is here to shed the light on this situation in the possession of some facts of fiction that somehow maybe didn't make much exposure publicly. But what I rather invite you is to simply partake in these reflections on war and peace. What is it that constitutes these two terms? These two terms that are of poignance and value because they shoot us straight into the heart. Because the line between the war and the peace is what makes this life into what it is. And therefore, before any sides can be taken, that attitude of veering towards the peace, towards the preservation of that value for which we are all here to enjoy as a given right, as that given privilege to be alive, is what separates this whole affair and makes it into totally something else whenever it comes to the armed conflict, whenever the military is involved, which means death and more destruction. So this title is not to give it a gouache aesthetic veneer, but war and peace have been attentively chosen because it's the title of a very well-known book by Leo Tolstoy. Of course, most of us contemporary people don't have the time to read it. It's as thick as the Bible. But those who have studied the so-called golden age of Russian literature, of course, know a thing or two about the names that Tolstoy here, as Leo Tolstoy, represents. And even though maybe most of you have heard about that particular work, not many of you are aware of another lesser known literary work which served as a debut for Tolstoy's literary genius, and that was dedicated to the war, or rather I should say not dedicated, but reads as documentary journal to the Crimean War, entitled in Russian as Sevastopolskие рассказы, or in English that would be known as the Sebastopol stories. So these Sebastopol stories speak of the horrors of the Crimean War, which took place sometimes at the end of the 19th century, and that Crimean War, where the great empire colonies at the time clashed for their geopolitical interests. So this kind of entrance into these reflections, I would like to begin precisely with the complexity of what characterizes this particular war. I don't know how historians will refer to this war. I don't know what the name they will give it to. Would it be known as Russian-Ukrainian conflict, or simply as a Ukrainian war, or whatever that else the historians may come up with? We are yet to know. What is important is that this sharing is welcomed and addressed to everyone, but in particular to those of you who are predispositioned by the way of your preferences not to be embracing any side too strongly and keeping that potentially very, very important place where one can hold any conflict, any situation in light of greater awareness, I should say, in light of where we can leave some space, some room for the possibility of holding the conflict within that area where we do not consciously choose to separate any party, any group of people into enemy. And that, of course, means that my address primarily to the spiritual folk, to those who have this predisposition in them already, predisposition for being able to see that what happens at the horizontal plane of affairs, no matter how dramatic, no matter how heartbreaking, no matter how unjust, straightforwardly in terms of its manifestation, we still know that this is just a certain level of perception and understanding, and that there are other levels, subtler levels, subtler reasons. And there is, of course, a unifying level, which is not a level at all. It's simply the field which unifies us all, those who happen to be perpetrators and those who happen to be the victims, those who happen to be the aggressors and those who happen to be the defenders. So I speak to that. And this Russian-Ukrainian conflict, this war, is almost so close to what we can find in some of the sacred traditions of the world in terms of direct example of how the cousins, how the relatives, when something goes wrong, can become deadly enemies. So I'm speaking here of that great epic of Mahabharata. Most of you have heard about that epic, and there is a part of that epic known as the Bhagavad Gita, which only forms a slim part of that greater book. And that Bhagavad Gita, which translates as the song of Lord, or the Lord's song, literally, Bhagavad Gita. Gita is the song. It's the loftiest teaching expounded by Lord Krishna on the battlefield to someone whom he served as his charioteer, a great warrior of his time, Arjuna. And the leitmotif of the Bhagavad Gita is the dispute that two relatives run into, the clan of Pandavas and the clan of Kauravas. Pandavas were those who have been brought up in the house of the blind king Dhritarashtra. the blind king Dhritarashtra took these 5 sons of Pandu, who were his nephews, and brought them up as his very own. So the playground of what served as that childhood and teenage years was where these cousins played freely, enjoyed that time together, only to become standing facing each other on the battlefield in that what the Bhagavad Gita is all about. So this comparison here is not just a kind of sweet, safe from any risk-taking which requires to take some side, detached spiritual bypassing. No. It's a great reminder, in fact, that what Ukrainian and Russians have faced now, and when they faced this, they facing each other on the battlefield, has been there since time immemorial in terms of the very nature of all conflicts. Because in the Bhagavad Gita, the reason for the war, although one can of course enlist various different reasons, was not so much the fact and the reality that they somehow all of a sudden begin to hate each other, but actually because of a treachery, a conceit that have been planted into that family, something which will blind the very vision of already blinded king, something which will blind the console of and the counsel of his wife, something which will blind even some of the greatest warriors of the time who happen to be the chief advisors to the court of King Dhritarashtra. So one way or another, there were other reasons which are much subtler. In the Bhagavad Gita, of course, these reasons are karmic, because the Pandavas and Kauravas must face this battle. And as all spiritual scriptures, or as all scriptures are concerned, there are different levels of reality that the scriptures ought to convey, portray. And this begins at the gross level of reality of the actual events, historical even events, in their very essence, down to how this wisdom of that particular scripture can be implemented at the subtler level of what this particular epic set to convey, and what sets of emotions, feelings that we undergo when we are exposed to these stories, what this aimed at invoking within our hearts, what it brings out into the open in terms of that necessity for the maturity of our psyche, so as to speed up the evolution of who we are and what we are doing here as earthlings. And of course, the ultimate message of all these epics is to give us the unpolarized by preferences view of reality, but to reconcile that view in utter and entire oneness of who we are and what is actually taking place here. Just as in that particular moment when Arjuna, overwhelmed with that emotion that drowns his heart with waves of compassion, when he looks at the battlefield and he recognizes on the other side of his army dear people to him with whom he grew up, dear people to him, including his own tutor, his own mentor, Drona, who happens to be standing among those who now will be defending the clan of Kauravas on the side of Dhritarashtra. So Arjuna's heart is overwhelmed. He doesn't want to fight, and he is the mightiest of all warriors. Let us not forget that. No maliciousness, no weakness, none of that. He is the power to reckon with. He is this great hero of his time. He is the greatest archer of his time. And yet, he sits down, put his bow down, and he declares in his, to that point, monologue to his charioteer Krishna that he is not going to fight because his whole being is torn between the duty which his mind commands him to do and what he feels in his heart. So that division, that split between the mind and the heart is being powerfully experienced by Arjuna. So he sits down, refusing to take actions because he sees no reason whatsoever in engaging this action, because what good can it bring us? And his reasonings are very sound. In fact, speaking and reading reading this, what Arjuna comes up with makes one rightly feel what is going on. Why do one even have to enter this battlefield? Why couldn't we just settle these affairs somehow at a different level? In exactly the very same way as it seems to be here with regard to this Ukrainian-Russian conflict, where all these attempts at diplomacy utterly and entirely failed. And I'm not going to go, perhaps not just now, into the ramifications of what this diplomacy was aiming at. What were the real sentiments of this diplomacy? Who was behind the very, very agendas that were set well before this conflict began? But just going back to the Bhagavad Gita, the Arjuna's resolve is to withstand from the battle. His state of despondency commands him unable to take action. It commands him to that state of being irresolute. And therefore that is known in the scripture as the Arjuna Vishada Yoga, the yoga of the despondency of Arjuna. This is the moment where the great hero of his time, unable to act, essentially admits that there is no power in him that can take over the conflict that he is experiencing between the mind and the heart. And at that very moment, the very teaching of the Bhagavad Gita unfolds. Because at that very moment, Krishna, who prior to that patiently was listening to Arjuna, now sees clearly that the mind of Arjuna, who prior to that was considered Krishna just as his mate, as his friend, is unable to make decisions on his own. So therefore he is in a state of complete and utter despondency and irresolution. So the teaching of the Gita begins at that very point, when the Lord speaks, when another voice is being raised altogether. The reasonings comes from a very different place altogether. And what Krishna does at this very moment, he first scolds Arjuna for the weakness of his character by urging him simply to stand up and face the battlefield face his destiny and do what he ought to do, because the enemy is already dead. He is here but an instrument of that divine intervention, which he is to complete as the warrior by birth that Arjuna was, belonging to the Kshatriya caste. His job is here to simply adhere to what he here to do. Not that that is the one and the only message. The Bhagavad Gita, as I said, has unfolded from that very moment, and various forms of yoga being introduced, the various forms of the science of unity being introduced from that very moment onwards. But this is a crucial moment, the moment when Krishna simply reminds Arjuna that his job is here to simply follow his dharma, the duty of him being born into a warrior caste, which means that he has to raise his bow and do his craft to his best, because nothing that he considers here, one way or another, is the actuality of the situation, but something else is at play altogether. Of course, it's tempting to continue with the teachings of the Gita, but the point of these reflections is not so much to go into the ultimate and the final parts of what the teachings of yoga here represent, that ultimate union with the disunion, where there is nothing other than the Lord, nothing other than the unified field that Krishna here represents as that divine within the heart of every human being. But we'll leave that just for a moment, simply because these reflections are meant to create a space, a possibility for being able to behold this, what the world is now seems to be on fire with, so as to see, is there even a way of relating this situation just at this very moment, as we receive hourly reports from that very battlefield, where the concreteness of the situation leaves very room for any philosophical, let alone abstract discussion on what is happening. But if we fail to do that on any other parts of the globe, where we are in a very different setting, in a very different situation, then we fail or bypass the possibility of being able to relate to such events with the fullness of the heart that these events represent, because obviously they represent something, even if at a subtle level, which doesn't only belong to the Russians and the Ukrainians, but it's something that belongs to all of us, all together at once. And this is relevant, or rather this can be spoken from the geopolitical narrative that runs way too obvious in terms of what is the root cause of this conflict. And again, many commentators have already pointed out that this particular conflict is so complex, is so intricate, is so shrouded in history, and also in the intricacies within the historical setting of the situational condition, let's say, of what Ukraine itself represents as that space, as that country. Because at the obviously level, this is the motherland of many, if not most, Ukrainians. But lest we forget immediately that, just as it have been reminded by many historians, that Ukraine and Russia have the same ties and connections and relations as this very example of the Pandavas and Kauravas, who happened to be cousins and grew up together, kicked the ball together, did all the things together as the years known as childhood and the teenage years known for. That free playful time, free of all concerns, free of the politicized perspective on the world, here and now, fully present to that what the shared history here is, in fact, inseparable part of what makes these nations great. What makes these nations great? Not, I will repeat, not what is being said over and over again in terms of how it aims to inflame the incentives of making that gap between these brotherly, sisterly nations apart. Contrary to that, what makes these nations great is not only their shared history, but also their shared suffering, their shared joys, their shared families, their shared children, their shared aspirations. Dare I say, their shared humanity of what makes them who they are. And yet all this is now being thwarted in the name of flags, in the name of political correctness, in the name of serving the interests of perhaps very, very few people out there who know no scruples, who know no ethics, who know no morals, because all these categories have long departed. It's but a shell of being called a human. Inside, something else is gnawing on the human heart, something which is of a very, very stinky and rotten in its very essence core. This is what is making this conflict so damn perplexing, because at the core of this conflict is the aim to destroy, aim to pull apart. The goal is to manipulate, turn people into instruments where they will be polarized by these newly created narratives, which also skillfully used, of course, the seeds that have been present in both Ukrainian and Russian people, the seeds of separation, the seeds of nationalism, the seeds of Nazism, the seeds of that what makes war into potentiality at all times. These seeds that are there to divide, not to unite. The seeds of hatred, the seeds of exclusivity, the seeds of righteousness, the seeds of entitlement. All these are the seeds that have been watered, carefully preserved. It doesn't matter that the Second World War has ended many, many decades ago. These very seeds were possibly carefully preserved. And when the time came, those who wanted to cause destruction and sorrow in the name and for their own, in the name of so-called democracy and for their own gain, use these very seeds to create the current situation into what it is. Leave it, or take it or leave it, as they say. These are sincerely, candidly spoken reflections of someone who is not free of bias, someone who is not free from being led astray. Like all of us, I'm here speaking from a place which is afforded by the clarity of my thought. And we know that thought is not to be trusted if we are to speak from the spiritual point of view. Thought is cowardly. Thought is not reliable. Thought is but something which divides us by the very, very polarizing nature of the way we are structured, even in terms of the duality of the brain structure. thought is inseparable, or rather a byproduct perhaps, of that very, very biochemical way of how we are made. Yet there is also something called intellect. There is also something called intuitive insight. There is something that speaks from beyond these spheres where the thought reigns supreme. This level is opened only to those of us who have access to the supreme state of non-duality, to the supreme state of oneness, supreme state untouched and unpolluted by the aforementioned preferences. And this supreme state is one and the only song that out there that can bring peace. It's the only whisper of the heart that actually speaks to the truth of the situation. Everything else is false, whatever position may be taken. Yes, of course, I should have began this talk by saying every aggression is an act of aggression. But this would be immediately falling into that political correctness, because as I said also, it's convenient to adopt the perspective that the war has begun a few days ago, when the war has never ended. The war is continuing. The war in that part of the world, in Donbass, was already for 8 years as the heavy artillery was shelling the so-called separatists. Who gave us the authority to call these people separatists? And why these people are separatists whilst other groups of people are called the liberators, or let's say freedom fighters? Who decides? Who makes this informed decision? Where do we know that this decision is coming from the right point of view, right angle? We don't. And we can never know. But the fact remains the same that 14,000 people, most of whom are civilians, and also happen to be, in terms of the percentage of population, ethnic Russians, died in these past 8 years. So the war hasn't begun. Let us broaden the scope of our perspective. The war hasn't begun in Ukraine. The war is continuously going on at any time, at all times, somewhere on this globe. Somewhere, somehow, it becomes profitable for the war to be here on this planet. And that's where the culprit of this conflict, and likewise of all the conflicts, where the military will get involved sooner or later, where the military action only an outcome of that wretched policy, wretched political policy to divide and conquer, separate, create an argument, distract people's attention, bring something as a valid point of narrative, indoctrinate, propagate, brainwash. Can you see how this makes this war as an inevitable result of what goes into the making of the war? And you can see how peace, on the other hand, is a very different state of affairs. So therefore, it boils down again and again and again that this peace cannot be reached at the agreement level of a round table. This peace can never be reached in the joining of the political parties of this United Nation, of yet another United Nation, of these sanctions, of that sanction, to create the possibility so there will be a peace. Peace is not a result of twisting someone's arm or imposing a condition on someone where one will not be able to wage a war. These are futile ways of pursuing peace. Peace is a result of a complete and utter absence of conflict in the heart of people. this is the aim of every true world leader. If that is not, that we still live in a dark age where we are shuffling in the dark, trying to find a way of how to remedy the situation. Glorious flowery talks, fantastically created clickbait titles that gives us this somehow a glimmer of hope that somehow we're pursuing the right perspective, somehow we are pursuing the righteous cause because we are pinning down the aggressor. We are creating heroes of our time, here and now. Heroes, we don't know truly a face and a look of a real hero. We make this into a public charade, whilst at the simplicity of it all, peace comes from this heart to that heart, to that heart, to that heart. So there is no peace at the heart of all of this. If those people who happen to be the leaders of our nations, if these people do not have peace in their heart, then all this is but a wishful thinking. All this is simply just happened that this particular conflict gains the attention of the entire masses. It does not mean much in terms of reality of the situation, and that it does not show us that we're suddenly learning something together. It only shows us that we're following the same hysteria. It only shows us that we're following the same pattern. So the fate of this world, the fate of the peaceful coexistence, again is in the hands of those who have no peace in themselves. So how can there be any peace? If there is a conflict, a wretched conflict in the heart of these people who have been placed in a position to guide, protect, lead, and all they're doing is pursuing the petty, because they are petty. If you raise to the top, if you happen to be at the top of the pyramid of the political power, and all you can do is to fill your pockets or become a puppet, then it's a petty affair. You're not exercising any glory here of being able to lead the nation, let alone to lead the world towards peaceful, harmonious coexistence. It's a charade as far as I'm concerned. It's a poor show. And that poor show cannot go any longer. So therefore, at the very core of this conflict is the lack of harmony in the hearts of those who are behind this, what unfolds as very obvious tragedy for many simple people out there. For many people, above all else, of course, for people in Ukraine, for Russian soldiers who happen to be in the military as that machine, part of that machine. But where is it all coming from? It all comes from impotence of our leaders, utter impotence. But it's not impotence because they happen to be impotent and they need some shot of Viagra to make them potent somehow. No. It comes from wretchedness of the heart which knows no peace. It's simply people who are very, very scared in the very domain of where they are, insecure, who don't know the real purpose of why they're here, who don't know what it means to be the instrument of the divine. This is the result of living in a secular culture that ours has become. Secular culture where empty arguments and slogans are flying around like rockets until they become real rockets, and then they're flying around whilst filling the coffers of already super rich. These are my reflections for today. Just as my heart is filled with sorrow, filled with compassion for those who now happen to be at the receiving end of this injustice. But at the same time, there is this resolution in my heart, a resolution of not taking any side whatsoever, not even taking the side of who is now, all too obvious, happen to be a victim of the circumstances, because there is no such thing. Perpetrator and victim are tight, closely interconnected, interrelated. Let us all look into the heart. Let us all look into our own heart and see if our heart harbors some kind of begrudge. Let us shed light onto that wretched state of affair. Let us free ourselves from these thorns so as to be that heart free of these polarizing tendencies, one at a time, one single heart at a time. Your heart, my heart, that will already suffice. Then 1,000 of these hearts freed from this contempt, division, then 100,000, then 1,000,000, then perhaps it will suffice to shed light and reverberate that very state of affairs, which will illumine the hearts of those who have forgot what it is like to have light, that light of divine essence in their own. So therefore, I don't agree that this conflict now is Russian-Ukrainian. It's not Russian-Ukrainian conflict. It's the epic that manifests itself right now. The timeless wisdom that these epics that I talked about at the very beginning is now playing itself out. So let us learn together what is the message of that song of the Lord. What is it now communicating? What is this war here reminding us? And how can we rise above this, what seems to be almost impossible task to do, because it's so much more somehow serving that condition to take the side, to take that kind of position, which nothing other than going into the trenches and not rising above the battlefield. So feel free to express yourself fully, what you feel, in your comments. If you disagree, feel free to express yourself. If you agree, feel free to express yourself. As I said, these reflections were not meant to give so-called my perspective of who is right or who is wrong in this conflict. The incentive, and I deeply trust that this incentive comes from the sincerity of the intent, comes purely from the need to speak it out, to let it out of my heart, so as to communicate this pain, communicate this angst that I feel in the face of this injustice, that all of us are now subjected. All of us are now subjected, because that's what the nature of the war. It does not leave anyone unaffected by it, because it further creates the war within. It adds to that inner conflict. So the only way is to retrieve into the place and the territory of peace. 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 May peace prevail. May all conflict subside, not only in Ukraine, but in every part of the world where it is brewing right now, where it is raging right now. May the oppressor and the oppressed recognize each other. May oppressor and the oppressed see each other eye to eye. May we recognize that all this is futile. May we recognize that this is all come from fear. All conflict rooted in fear that somehow we can be harmed, in fear that we somehow can be extinguished. It's rooted in the sense of scarcity, in our potentials, in our capacities, in our resources, which are unlimited, just as we are eternal, because the core of who we are is eternal, unborn, here forever. With love to you all.